Amazon Game Studios faces a war of incentives. Their natural incentive to me, to my mind, the natural incentive of wanting to listen to the player base, of being a sympathetic provider of enjoyable experiences to a player base who's hungry for more, will slouch New World towards a potentially generic feeling MMO over time. Many would be fine with this. I think foolishly so. Amazon Game Studios, of course, ignores feedback at their peril. You cannot leave feedback on the table. You cannot ignore what people are saying. If they over respond to feedback, that's also bad. There's a terrible balance that must be struck. In a mature genre, Amazon Game Studios has to do what everyone else does well enough, and they also have to keep their game feeling unique. That's the challenge. What's up, y'all? I'm Deeg, here today thinking about whether New World Slide into a theme park MMO is inevitable. What do you think? New World is a game that's been in development since around 2016. People behind the scenes have suggested that its early state was a very hardcore survival type game. It's not that today, though, is it? I had a chance to get my hands on it back on the public test in 2020 and on the closed beta that happened just a few weeks ago this year in 2021. It is anticipated, barring no further delays, to release about a month from today on September 28th. But why would I suggest that it slide into a theme park game might be something that could occur? Will this be good or would be bad? Well, a slide suggests a downward trend, doesn't it? I'm bringing this up because the game, like I mentioned, has changed a lot. But before I get into the nitty gritty on New World, what I want to do is establish a sort of a frame for this discussion. Because for me, the way I want to talk about this is going to depend on understanding a certain model of examination. And I'm going to try to get through it quickly and simply and effectively as all good teachers would. So we'll see if I manage it. And I want to begin to present this idea with a little allegorical story that actually happened in my real life. So put yourself back in time. Young Deeg, not too young, failed out of college and living off of parents young, if you can put yourself in that frame of mind. So imagine me. I'm living at home after college. I don't yet have a job, so I've got no money of my own, really. It's a town where there's not a lot of jobs for young people, unless you like to hike. So I have a friend come nearby into town, and they want to meet up and see me and go watch a movie. So I do what anyone would do in that situation who's got no money and has an opportunity like that. I ask my parents for $20 for a ticket and some concessions to go see my friend over and go to a movie. I asked my dad, what's he say? No. You've got to get into the habit of making and spending your own money. Fuck. Well, that sucks. Mom heard that. But surreptitiously, behind my father's back, she slips me a $20 bill with a note that says that she doesn't want me to miss seeing my friend. Which parent was right here? Was my father right to suggest that I needed to get into the habit of making my own and spending my own money? And implicitly, that missing an opportunity like this would help me remember that? Or was my mom right that the most important thing was for me not to miss seeing my friend? Well, looking back at it from the benefit of being a 30-something old man, I think the way I see it now is they're both right. So, what are these two approaches and why are they relevant to this discussion? Let's bring up the graphic. Not a graphic so much as a text document. Taking a note from Devin Nash here. What I want to do is describe these two approaches towards dealing with a situation, solving a problem, towards curating an experience for somebody in along a specific axis at the extremes of which, on either end of the extremes of this axis, are these two ideals. An ideal of privation, or which requires a person to take in order to enjoy the experience, and an ideal of provision, which requires a player to receive. Roughly speaking, privation, taking this side of it, is going to be talking about increasing demands on the player, presenting bigger, more difficult challenges. Whereas the provision, the receiving side, will be discussing more about reducing demands on the player, making sure things are fair. So again, these are two extremes, the two kinds of knobs that you want to dial into complementary states to make sure things feel good. So how does this apply to New World? Well, New World is an MMO game, and I think we can all think of examples from MMOs that we've played, virtual worlds that we've spent time in, where we've seen systems that clock on different extremes of this privation, provision, axis. Let's think of a few. Privation, number one. How about a game with permadeath? That's pretty brutal. Permadeath really challenges people by making the consequences of loss very severe. Again, increasing demands on the player. How about another one? Rare loot. I've talked about this many times before. The Hand of Sulfuras is a remarkable weapon, not because it's expensive to make in World of Warcraft Vanilla, but because you only see 2 drop a year if you clear the boss every single week. It's rare. Rare loot is a challenge. Now, let's see if there are equivalents to these kinds of domains of game design on the other side of this axis. So, permadeath on the hardcore side. On the other side, we have, let's say, downstate. If you die, you don't really die. You can kind of get a chance to come back. Another example of this would be something like the ability to instantly revive if you have certain items in your inventory. Anything that softens the outcome of defeat. Rare loot. So an approach to rare loot that would be more on the giving side of design will be to make sure that there are either guaranteed loot drops or personal loot, so you don't have to share it. So I'm bringing these examples in as two ways of thinking about the opposite ends of this axis of privation and provision. I'm just going to rattle off a few more here that I have written down. Slow leveling. Open world PvP. Group content. Now, other approach to this, the opposite extreme, fast leveling, boosts. Instanced or optional PvP. And solo content. These are all different applications of these forces acting on MMO game system design. And I'm going to ask you to give me some latitude here. I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining this. I want to get into the game stuff, but I think it's kind of important. Okay, so what else? The point I want to try to make here and drive home is that each of these forces have their own individual payoffs that are worth preserving. And you can't have an experience that is completely defined by one or the other without creating a large imbalance in the experience in some way. So the payoff of having a lot of privation in your game design is that the outcomes when you win more satisfying. When you defeat that difficult boss, when you defeat that group content, when you get that rare loot, when you survive in permadeath, the satisfaction is much, much more abiding. The pain of privation is that it's more difficult. Attracts hardcore. Let's go to the other side of the aisle. The payoff of a more provision receiving kind of approach. Less difficult. More people can experience it. More people get a chance to see the thing that was made by artists and designers and talented programmers. The pain is it's less satisfying. When you get loot that everyone else gets, it doesn't matter as much, does it? When you boost versus leveling by hand, level doesn't mean a lot, does it? When you defeat content that didn't require you to group up with players or coordinate, it's not as satisfying. Yes, more people will get to do it, but the rewards for those who choose to engage will be less. And I'm not talking about reward design, the extrinsic reward. That's something totally different. I'm just talking about the intrinsic design, the intrinsic rewards of experiencing the content and the moment-to-moment knowledge that what you're doing is taking on a challenge and the feeling of reward intrinsically you get or don't get for defeating a challenge. And this attracts more casual players. So now you can, I think, start to see what the direction I'm taking this discussion in. I led this whole thing off by sort of accusing New World of going into a more theme park-like design, which I'm going to associate more with the right side of this spectrum, more the provision receiving side. But the argument I'm going to present is going to suggest that that's not necessarily a bad thing. And we can look to what Amazon is doing as, I think, a potentially quite smart thing. The trick will be whether they can maintain the proper balance. Okay. Moving on. To put everyone to sleep, I'm just going to make a philosophical point about both of these forces on system design. Philosophically, privation demands the attention of our greatest heroes. Without privation, heroism is a farce. Think about that scene in The Matrix. I think it was Matrix 2 or Matrix 3, when one of the Agent Smiths told Neo that the first version of the Matrix was a paradise. It was made to give humans everything they wanted and strive for, but it was rejected. Why was it rejected? Because they had no challenge to face. They had no problem to overcome. They had no world to contend with. And when that reality surfaces in our games, people feel rightly repulsed by that situation. And the reason I'm spelling this out is not just because of New World, but there's a big conversation going on in MMO gaming overall. I think one of the tentpole examples is you look at a guy like Asmongold talking about World of Warcraft. The main critique he has of World of Warcraft is that it does not sufficiently demand the attention of great heroes. Why do people spit on players using store mounts? Because they were given that. They didn't have to face a great challenge in the game in order to receive that, did they? And because of that, that reduced the value of everything he'd done, didn't it? I'm sympathetic to this argument. But as a counter argument. Perhaps you've heard of the term accumulated advantage. If you haven't, I'll briefly describe. It's illustrated in this by the saying, rich get rich, and the poor get poorer. Why is this important? It demonstrates a observed phenomenon in the real world that the more advantage that gets accumulated onto an individual or a group, the more likely that individual or group will be able to acquire additional advantage. There's a multiplying effect on success and on suffering that is somehow inevitable within the world to some extent. This is also called the Matthew principle? I think it's the Matthew principle. It's a verse in the Bible. Look it up if you're interested. But without some kind of mediating force to prevent the success being overly multiplied by the successful and suffering being over multiplied by the suffering, then you get a situation where you have a society that is not sufficiently just. You have a culture of unfairness where you think about an example in a gaming world, right? Someone with the most loot can be the most successful in taking on challenges that give them more loot, right? So let's write down providing for all mitigates accumulated advantage. All right, that's about as highbrow as we're going to get. Now, I want to finally pay off the promise of this, our introduction, and talk about New World. So, how can we use these concepts and this framework to look at the way New World has progressed over the last few years? So, like I mentioned, New World started as a game that was a hardcore sandbox PvP game. It wasn't trying to be in massive an MMO with dungeons. It wasn't trying to give you a big questing experience. It was trying to be a survival kind of game. But they received feedback, and they received it well, and they transformed their game over time to be more appealing to more people by making things more fair and creating experiences that can be experienced by more people. That is to say, they turned the knob up on provision, on providing for their players, and turned the knob down on the privation affecting people in that experience. Let's look at some examples. New World started life as a full loot PvP game. Ouch. That is hardcore and brutal. And it's very satisfying to win, horrible to lose, and you have probably a lot more losers than you have winners, let's be honest. Since then, New World added PvE questing. Boom. That's a huge feature that almost everyone in the game is going to get to experience, where you go up against PvE monsters who are not going to put up a big fight. In fact, one of the big things that I noted that changed from the public test in 2020 to the closed beta in 2021 that I don't hear anyone else talking about is the fact that mobs in the open world are just a joke compared to how hard they used to be. But then again, maybe I just sucked in 2020. That's possible too. Another thing, they added instances. So taking the experience from the world and putting it in a cordoned off area that is controlled and where you won't be fucked with by other players. That is another accessibility feature that is providing a fair experience for players. This is the force of provision. Next, added PvP unflagging. You can completely opt out of open world PvP in this game. Go to Eternum. Fight your factional war. But only if you want to. Like everyone, it's like 95% of the world of a tournament are just like it's like a Swiss neutrality almost. The funny thing is, you get all the benefits of aligning with a faction, even if you don't fight for it. And if you flag up, the likelihood you're going to come across another player that's flagged up is very low because the incentives are not hard aligned for open world PvP very well in New World. But maybe this is a good thing. What happens in a game like New World if you make PvP flagging mandatory? Well, of course, it's going to drive away some people who don't want that experience. Let's say a lot of people. Who's it going to leave? It's going to leave people who like open world PvP content. Who are those players? Well, some of those players are going to be folks, I'm sure, like me, who want a balanced experience, a little bit of both, but it's also going to heavily attract hardcore PvP players who will spend their entire time ganking people and making them feel miserable. So this change takes the edges off of that problem. It turns down the knob on the privating force, the satisfaction that the most hardcore players get from PvP in order to make more people have access to the experience. What else? Oh, PvP loot. So you can't loot items off of your dead PvP foes anymore. Losing loot when you die in PvP, man, that is hardcore. But it's been totally removed from New World. What else? Cash shop. Baby, this is a big one. On launch, New World is going to have a cash shop full of cosmetic options. So what's the big deal about that? A lot of games do this. Well, maybe it's not a big deal. To some it is, to some it's not. Let's put it this way. Adding a cash shop with cosmetics, cosmetic microtransactions increases access to cosmetics. It means you don't got to play the game to get the aesthetic rewards. You don't got to defeat bosses to get armor skins. You don't got to do stuff in the world. You can just completely opt out and have the mothering force of the cash shop give you, and you can just receive those payoffs. Downside is that every time you look at a character, you're not going to be sure whether their gear came from being out in the world and contending with it, or if it came from them just opening their wallets. This is one of the things that you'll see the Asmongold types complaining about. And I'm sympathetic to that argument. I've talked about this a moment ago. It is true that if you have something in a game and you take some of that and you sell it in the store, it dilutes the entire access of achievement that loot circumscribes. I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of anything that was a rewarding game that got moved to a cash shop over time. But I think it explains itself. I hope it does. And in a truly hardcore dedicated game where the forces of privation, which allow for the most satisfaction, were turned up to max, you wouldn't have cash shops. Right? You wouldn't be diluting the reward loops of your game with wallet opening. But this does a couple things. Number one, it adds some potential fairness to the outsized rewards of the most dedicated and distributes them among the whole population of players playing a game. It also, of course, makes them money. So the other point I wanted to make here is introduces a conflict of interest between the business and game. What do I mean when I say that? Well, let's say you've got people who are doing dedicated armor design. And let's say they make a badass piece of armor. And the designer's like, okay, I'm going to put this in the game. Where's it going to go? And I'm sure I'm oversimplifying this process. If you're a game developer and you're hearing this, I'm sorry. I know this is oversimplification. In fact, all this is oversimplified. But the conflict of interest is presented when, as a studio, needs to be a decision about whether new pieces of armor and loot go into the game as drops that are behind boss kills or achievements or some other method of engaging with the game, fishing, let's say, or just put them in the cash shop as a straight cash transaction. The conflict of interest is because they are monetarily incentivized to put it in the cash shop as a short-term cash return they can get very quickly. The part of the equation that I think is not well understood by the let's call it the gamer media, and I think this is more well understood on the studio publisher side, though no one talks about it, is that there's also a long-term calculation that has to be done. What percentage of rewards do you have to put in the game in order for people to still feel like achieving things in the game matters? I'm sure there's a sweet spot there. I don't know what it is. And all the same logic can be applied to the convenience items that we know will be added to the game in the future. As you can see, things are stacking up on the giving side, the receiving side of the equation here. So, let's ask ourselves this question. All this stuff is great. I think that the dungeons are actually pretty cool. I think that there probably is some smartness in allowing PvP flagging to go on and off, even though I personally am attracted to the idea of a full PvP game. I understand why they've made the decision that they made. I think it probably will make a more full and balanced game overall into the future. But if we challenge ourselves to answer the question, well, what is the most central to New World's identity? What game system, what feature is the most central to making New World a unique offering that is worth giving your attention to over another similar title, like a Final Fantasy, like a World of Warcraft, like a Guild Wars, Elder Scrolls Online, SWTOR, stuff like that? What is it that makes it different? Well, you could say the combat gathering crafting loop. I think that would be a satisfying answer to that posed question. New World combat is unique. It feels good. Gathering, the same. Crafting, the same. All fairly unique and feels good. But I don't think even though it's a satisfying answer to my prompt, I don't think it is the best answer. I think the best answer to what makes New World uniquely identifiable is its territory system. And I'm speaking as someone who did not play the old big PvP MMOs of the past. I never played ArcAge, stuff like that. I missed the boat on those experiences. So if I'm talking out my ass, please let me know in the comments. But my impression is among the major MMOs that have market share today, this territorial control aspect is not something that is happening. And what makes this system so cool is that it takes open world PvP and it provides an incentive to open world PvP, but not an individual incentive. It's not about ganking for honor points. It's about getting the street cred of having your company's banner flying over Everfall. And that is badass. Yes, there's some like taxation you can do. I think that there are going to be people, especially spreadsheet warriors, who are really into that stuff, that part of it. But to me, what's cool about that is the mere fact of flipping the color of that territory, being the governor, and that's your space, you know? When does the honeymoon of that incentive fall off? That's a good question, Ro. But I'm going to go ahead and add the territory game over here into more on the privation taking side of things. Why am I doing that? Well, I'm doing this because the territory game in New World is necessarily has a lot of friction built into it. Because if it didn't, and if capturing territory was easy, no one would care. And maybe they won't. We haven't seen the territory game played to the greatest extent. It hasn't been pushed to its limits, at least not with open doors, not in the public test. But from what I saw from it, here's what it looks like. In order to put a territory into contention, you have to do open world PvP and open world PvP quests, which means you have to fight other players, or you have to put yourself into a vulnerable position where you can be fought by other players. If you're attacking, you're going into their territory to do this. Once you tip the territory over into a place where you can declare war, you have to pony up a war chest to declare the war. And then once that happens, you have to organize and plan the conflict. It's 50 players versus 50 players. And of course, the defenders have an advantage. So let's say you show up and you win. If you do that, you've won by successfully getting open world PvP control of the territory for long enough to tip it into conflict. You've done this by ponying up a war chest in order to declare war. You've done this by coordinating 50 players to arrive and successfully defend at uneven odds, successfully attack at uneven odds and capture the territory. That is an experience with an amount of friction that most players are not going to want to experience. This is my assessment that I gave a few weeks ago when I did my New World Ready for Launch video. I think that the territory system, as good as it is going to be one that most players will not really engage with. Because it is something that is self-selecting of players who really care about those more intangible benefits. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will make the payoff for controlling taxation in a territory so strong that it will be undeniable. Maybe. Oh, stream seems frozen. Riker, I'm really glad you said that. My webcam has gone to the dark side. Hang on. Okay. But the reason I'm suggesting that the PvP flagging system being so optional is a smart idea is because it means that you don't have to be a part of this territory game if you don't want to be a part of it. And in a way, if you're trying to design a game that has some more hardcore elements, like the territory game, where the most organized and best, most skilled force wins, then you want only players who self-select into those game systems to be the ones participating. You don't necessarily want the PvE dungeon grinders in the territory game. Because having people who are there for the outcomes rather than from the experience tends to create a lot of cognitive dissonance in these gaming experiences. Just look to World of Warcraft when raiders are put in a position where they have to PvP in order for the gear they need to take down bosses and raids. Nobody likes that. PvPers don't like that. The PvEers don't like that. Riker says, I had a lot of fun with the territory wars, but it seems like it's just pissing off more casual players. Yes, exactly. I think over time, casual players are going to sort themselves out of the territory game within New World. And I don't know if there's any way that can be changed. And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. But I think that this territory game, the whole reason I brought this up originally is to suggest that it is one of the most game-defining systems of New World. To me, if I look at New World as an outsider, the dungeons don't get me to play it. Even the cool combat doesn't get me to play it. The battlegrounds don't get me to play it. It's the territory game that makes me like, ooh, I should give this my attention rather than the 6 other MMOs that have been out for the last 7 to 9 years and have that much content available for me right now. That's important. What else do I have here for notes? Yeah, okay. So here's a better way of putting this. The territory game is at the end of a long funnel. This is a marketing term. A marketing funnel is the idea where you start with a large group of people, and then through successive stages of gauging interest, you narrow it down to a more and more well qualified audience for your product. You start with open world PvP, flagging up. That's the top of the funnel. And then you go towards grinding PvP quests for your faction. That narrows the funnel some more. And then you go towards actually showing up in time for a war. That narrows the funnel. Being able to win wars and take them seriously. That narrows it even further. So, yeah. I'm just saying the same thing 10 different ways. Apparently, I don't feel confident enough to just say it and leave it. This is a game mode for groups, not individuals. This is one of the most important, I think, points to make here, is that anything in the game that requires grouping up an organization is inherently a little more hardcore than solo stuff. And when it's PvP, when it's zero sum, when in order for one person to win, someone else must lose, it makes it that much more hardcore as well. What else do I have here? Wars are fun and infrequent, but subject to social connectivity. Yes. So you have to play a social game in order to enjoy the territory game. It is inherently social, and a lot of people are playing these experiences not because they want to connect with people, because they want to connect with worlds. That is a truth that a lot of modern games are learning, and it's to my way of thinking, is one of the main forces of providing that has guided MMOs into a more theme park-like state. The stress of losing territory won't be tolerable to most players. Even if you go through the bother, say you're a dungeon runner, you're a grinder, and you bother with a territory game, but then you have to defend it a couple times a week. Ugh. Eventually, it'll get tiresome, right? Maybe you want to do things to prevent people from attacking you, so you engage open world PvP or whatever. I don't know. But there's a stress of losing something you've gained there. It takes a lot of privation to capture territory, and access to the payoff of the territory game is low. Most players will not have access to it. Okay, and here's where I'm going with this. I described how New World has heard feedback and changed its game design, softened its hardcore elements to suit a bigger audience. I described how one of the most game-defining aspects of New World, the territory system, is inherently going to be more well-suited to a hardcore few than a broad base. So where does this leave New World, not on September 28th, but on December 28th, on March 28th, on June 28th? Where are we going to be at a year out from launch? Over time, features that get worked on equal features that are played by most players. This is a phenomenon you can see very clearly with many, many games that are developed over time. It's natural. It's totally natural to want to give attention to the part of your game that's doing the best. Double down on success, right? But what if the part of your game that most people play is the part of your game is just like what everyone else is doing? Is that really where you want to double down on? And here's the risk for Amazon Game Studios. Because they can go that direction and go to theme park. And they can make a game that is just like an Eternum flavored version of World of Warcraft or Elder Scrolls Online or any of these other great games that are out that are available today. But the other risk is making open world over time, making open world PvP too beneficial would be even worse. Think about the honor system when it was introduced in World of Warcraft Vanilla and World of Warcraft Classic. Both of these incentivized horrifying behaviors on behalf of the players that made the game universally worse for everyone playing the game. People look back and they idealize the early days of Terran Mill versus South Shore. And yeah, there was an unsophisticated truth in the beauty of that experience, but it didn't last long. It didn't live long. The actual end state reality of that design is camping flight masters. And that's not fun. That's just crap. Too hardcore. Amazon Game Studios faces a war of incentives. Their natural incentive to me, to my mind, the natural incentive of wanting to listen to the player base, of being a sympathetic provider of enjoyable experiences to a player base who's hungry for more, will slouch New World towards a potentially generic feeling MMO over time. Many would be fine with this. I think foolishly so. In a mature genre, Amazon Game Studios, of course, ignores feedback at their peril. You cannot leave feedback on the table. You cannot ignore what people are saying. But if they over-respond to feedback, that's also bad. There's a terrible balance that must be struck. And I'm speaking mostly to gamers when I say this, because if you've made games, Rel, I know you know what I'm talking about. You know this. Like this is like obvious to you. But I don't think it's very obvious to a lot of gamers. Amazon Game Studios has to do what everyone else does well enough, and they also have to keep their game feeling unique. That's the challenge that they face. Now, I have a real sense that in some sense we have not seen every part of the plan for New World. I think that there's a slow, patient unfolding of things that's happening. I have an overall sense of restraint when it comes to what they're putting in, which means that they're holding stuff back to make sure that what goes in is the right thing. And that's a good feeling for me to have. But what do you think?